Do you ever feel like you're juggling 5 things at once during work, but look back at the end of the day and feel like you've barely made a dent in your to-do list? If you work a 9 to 5 desk job, one factor that may be contributing to this perpetually stressed state is an endless stream of new messages. In a single workday, the average professional gets about 120 emails and spends almost a third of their time reading and answering them, according to consulting firm McKinsey. With this in mind, are emails and instant messaging the way forward? Cal Newport says no. Newport is an associate professor of computer science at Georgetown University. He's also the author of the book A World Without Email: Reimagining Work in an Age of Communication Overload. While email may seem like an unavoidable way of life for many of us, Newport argues that this method of communication leads to burnout and lowers productivity across the board by pulling people away from their preset goals for the day.
The main issue is that it forces us to constantly tend these conversations. It's why today, at least in one study, the average American knowledge worker is going to check an inbox once every 6 minutes. It's because if you have 3 or 4 dozen ongoing asynchronous back and forth discussions happening via email, you have to keep checking that inbox, because if you don't, things are going to slow down, things are going to get missed, people are going to have to wait for you. This constant checking is the real villain if we want to look at productivity, especially in the early 21st century, is because to check this inbox all the time requires you to shift your context. So let's say you're writing a memo, and then you change your attention to an inbox because you have to tend these hyperactive hive mind back and forth conversations. And that's going to trigger a complex and time-consuming neurochemical cascade to try to shift your attention to the context of that inbox. But what we do is we then rip our attention back to the main thing we're doing before that cascade finishes, and it all gets jumbled. And the effect is we can't think clearly, and we feel fatigued, and we feel stressed and anxious.
Before email, there were few digital distractions clouding our days. People relied on scheduled in-person meetings or sending a question over fax. However, Newport says that once email was introduced into the business landscape, it spread like wildfire.
Email spread very rapidly in the first half of the 1990s, and the main goal it was accomplishing was replacing fax machines, voicemails, and memos, inter-office memos. Email could implement these things much more cheaply and much faster. So it was seen as a bit of a productivity silver bullet when it came around, which is why it had such a rapid rise once that tech became available. And what you see is by 1995, this had gone from a niche product to a $500 million a year industry. So once the major office productivity players of that time, like Lotus and Microsoft, got involved in pushing out these products, it really helped it spread because there was trusted companies producing slick server software, and we were off to the races when it came to email communication.
And today, it isn't just email. There's Google Chat, WhatsApp, Microsoft Teams, and newcomers like Zoom and Slack. What's Slack? It's an instant messaging software that allows users to set up chat rooms called channels that are organized by topics or for specific groups of people. On these many platforms, people can send an invite for a last-minute meeting or easily send a pop-up chat. And the pandemic has only made this informal back and forth more frequent as a greater number of employees stay remote. Newport says that this constant interruption is unnatural and leads to serious productivity issues.
We're tasked with getting hard things done with our brain, and at the same time put into an environment where we have to check an inbox once every 6 minutes. It's a torturous setup in which we're making our work impossible to do or impossible to do well. It leads to more burnout. It leads to more turnover. It pushes people out of the workflow. And this style of work also creates unexpected inequities because when all we do is check inboxes during the day, we have to try to find time in the morning and the evening to actually use our brain and get things done. But access to that time is not fairly distributed. I mean, if you have kids or not makes a difference. If you're taking care of an aged relative after work or not makes a difference. And so there's a lot of issues with saying, here's the way we're going to work. Just constantly be a part of all these digital chatter. Just constantly be a part of all this back and forth. It's causing way more trouble than I think we realize.
So what's a possible solution? Many may argue that people need to have better digital etiquette or set stricter boundaries on when to check messages. However, Newport believes there needs to be a complete shift. He says small changes like turning off notifications or limiting chats doesn't address the root of the problem. Instead, more workplaces should emulate existing methods that have already been shown to help. Take the field of computer science, for instance, where many programmers worked from home long before the pandemic.
One idea they will often deploy is something known as a shared task board. So there'll be a board, these used to be physical and now they're virtual, same idea, where all the things that need to be done for the current project are a card on this board in a column that represents its status. Like, we're waiting to do this, this is currently being done, this has been done, we're waiting for someone to check it. It's very clear what has to be done and then who is working on what. They'll then have these daily, they're called standing status meetings. They're very short and they're highly structured. When everyone in the team looks at the same board, you go person by person, okay, what did you do yesterday? What are you working on today? What do you need from other people to make sure that you get that done? You go boom, 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 everyone in the group, update that board, and then people go and work. You could do the same thing by just being on Slack all day and, hey, I think I'm going to work on this now. What about this? Hey, can you help me with this? But you would have a fraction of the productivity because you'd have to constantly be context shifting. So that's an example of what it looks like once you say, let's get serious about thinking, how do we actually want to organize the work we do, figure out what needs to be done, who's working on it, and what information they need. When you structure that, you can significantly reduce the number of unscheduled back and forth messages you need to actually get these things done.
Newport highlights another technique that customer service employees often use to systematically handle tasks while maintaining organization.
You might be concerned if it's just better to be very accessible because being accessible and answering questions is what I do. But even in these type of industries, we often see there's a confusion between accessibility and clarity. We think what people need is constant access to us at all times, but really what they need is just clarity about, if I have an issue, I know exactly how I'm going to get that resolved. We saw this with the IT industry about 15, 20 years ago when they shifted over to a ticketing model. They realized that just letting people call them or email them when they had an issue with their computers in their organization would quickly spiral out of control. So they built these ticketing systems where you get a ticket, we're working on it, you get automatic updates, but it allowed the IT professionals to just work on one thing at a time and let the system keep track of, here's what's being done, here's its status. They can take a ticket, work on it, then update the ticket in the system. People were largely fine with that because they had clarity. Here's the ticket, here's my number, I'm getting updates, I know this is being handled. So it's okay that I can't just pick up the phone necessarily and get one of the people on the line right away.
So how can businesses without a clear communication structure in place get started? Newport recommends splitting your employees apart into teams based on workflow and allowing each group to set their own rules.
Empower teams to figure out among themselves what rules they internally want to use. They should write them down. They should check in on them regularly because it's hard to get right at first. You have to experiment, and they should have what I call safety valves. All right, if something goes wrong we weren't expecting, we have a fallback. So like nothing too bad can happen. We all get on the phone, we have a number, whatever, so that no one is too stressed about it. Once a team has worked out how they want to collaborate internally, they can also work out their interface to other teams. So, okay, if you want to send us new requests for work we have to do, that's great, but here's how we do it. Put the description in this Dropbox and send us a note. We check the Dropbox twice a week, etc., right? So teams can figure out their own internal processes and then figure out how the outside world can actually interface with them.
Communicating in a way that doesn't overload people is a tough problem to solve in a digitally driven world. But as more workers stay remote and messaging platforms expand, it's vital to put in place clear communication structures rather than relying on lengthy email threads and chats. To find out more about this topic and our guest, Cal Newport, head to viewpointsradio.org. You can check out his new book, A World Without Email, Reimagining Work in an Age of Communication Overload, online and in bookstores. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. Studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson.
Viewpoints returns in just a moment.
2 nationwide surveys find that discrimination is a significant barrier to care for people with Alzheimer's and dementia. Half or more of non-white Alzheimer's caregivers report they face discrimination in navigating health care for their recipient. Dr. Carl V. Hill is Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer of the Alzheimer's Association.
The data suggests we have a long way to go to address lack of health equity in healthcare. More than 80% of non-white racial and ethnic groups say it's important for Alzheimer's care providers to understand their backgrounds and experiences. But fewer than half of Blacks and only about 60% of Hispanics and Asian Americans feel confident about their access to culturally competent providers.
The surveys also reveal a lack of trust among Blacks in research clinical trials, and half doubt that advances in Alzheimer's treatments would be shared. These findings are part of the 2021 Alzheimer's Association Facts and Figures Report. Find out more at alz.org/facts.
Welcome to today's Book Minute, brought to you by Booktrib.com, the leading source of book news and reviews. In today's segment, The Hunger Games meets Westworld. Unfettered Journey by Gary F. Benger is science fiction at its very best. In fact, the author has been likened to sci-fi icons Huxley and Asimov. In the story, an artificial intelligence scientist seeks to create true robot consciousness. He leaves everything behind to find answers, but a mysterious woman on a personal mission interrupts his search. Fighting unjust forces, they are swept into an evil plot that neither can elude. Their struggles test the resilience of the human spirit. Set in a richly imagined near future, this is a cross-genre novel combining thrilling action, adventure, and a love story. It traces an epic journey from inside the human mind to the vastness of space. Released only last September in the U.S., by January, the book had already hit 10 Amazon bestseller lists. Be an early reader of Unfettered Journey, found wherever you buy your favorite books.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows. And find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints. Coming up next week.
The technology is simple in a lot of ways, and we already have these issues. What's going to happen as it becomes more powerful and more complex? We have to start thinking about this now.
The field of artificial intelligence and its modern applications. Then,
I was sitting there at the end of my 30s and being like, did I do this wrong? I'm happy, but am I alone?
The woes of sticking to the traditional timelines of adulthood. I'm Marty Peterson.
and I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.